When the arrogant Lady Victoria marched into Blackrock Castle, she expected to find a broken king. Instead, she found a crippled, trembling maid standing on the grand staircase. She laughed, calling her kitchen trash, fully expecting the fragile maid to drop to her knees in fear. It was a fatal mistake. She didn't notice the towering, massive shadow emerging from the dark behind the stairs, and she had absolutely no idea that the terrifying Iron Wolf had just drawn his broadsword, ready to burn the entire world to ashes for a single insult against his fragile savior. Spring rain lashed against the high windows of the library. Water ran down the glass, blurring the distant peaks into gray shapes. Bridget sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth. Her hands rested flat on the polished oak table. She wore a dress of thick blue wool. It lacked silver embroidery or lace, but it was warm. The fabric still felt foreign against her skin. For 19 years, she had only known the itch of raw burlap and grease-stained aprons. Her right knee still throbbed when the weather turned damp. The maester said the bone had knit badly long ago, and no medicine could fix a childhood break. She traced the grain of the wood with her index finger. A silver tray sat beside her elbow. It held a cup of sweetened tea and a plate of sliced apples. A young servant girl stood by the door, waiting. Her name was Clara, and she looked terrified. "You may go, Clara," Bridget said softly. Clara curtsied fast and practically ran from the room. Bridget sighed. She understood that fear. It was the same fear she used to feel when Mistress Martha walked into the kitchen. Now, the servants looked at Bridget with that same wide-eyed panic. They knew Robert had burned the old hierarchy to the ground for her. She was no longer the crippled maid. She was the king's ward. Yet, her mind had not accepted the promotion. When a speck of ash drifted from the fire onto the floor, Bridget instinctively reached for a rag that was no longer in her pocket. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into a fist. She had to unlearn the scullery. Down in the muddy courtyard, the rhythm of a working forge rang clear over the rain. Robert was not resting. He had spent the last 3 weeks ripping William's legacy out of Blackrock Castle. He drilled the remaining loyalist soldiers from dawn until dusk. He sent riders to the western borders to rally the scattered banners. He worked with a cold, singular focus. Bridget rarely saw him during the day. He kept a deliberate distance, allowing her space to heal in the quiet wing of the keep. But every evening, he came to the library. He never asked her to entertain him. He simply sat in the armchair opposite hers and read reports. His presence anchored her. It pushed the lingering nightmares of the dark cage away. A sudden blast of a heavy iron horn shattered the morning quiet. Bridget jumped in her chair. The tea in her cup spilled over the rim. 3 sharp notes echoed from the outer datehouse. It was not an alarm for attack, but a formal announcement of arrival. She stood up, her bad leg stiffened, and she leaned heavily against the table to find her balance. Curiosity overrode her usual desire to hide. She limped out of the library and into the wide stone corridor. The upper gallery overlooked the main entrance hall. Bridget stood behind a marble pillar, looking down at the commotion. Heavy wooden doors opened. Wind and rain swept into the hall, carrying the smell of wet horses. A dozen men marched inside. They wore polished steel armor and gray cloaks trimmed with fox fur. These were not Robert's men. They bore the emblem of the Eastern River. A woman walked at the center of the formation. She pulled back her velvet hood to reveal braided blonde hair. Lady Victoria of House Vance. Bridget recognized her from the winter feasts. Victoria was a cousin to the usurper William. She had always commanded the high table with sharp words and a cruel laugh. "Where is the resurrected king?" Victoria demanded. Her voice cut through the hall like a drawn blade. The captain of the castle guard stepped forward. He kept his hand near his sword hilt. "King Robert is in the armory, my lady. He did not expect an envoy today." "I am not an envoy," Victoria snapped. "I am here to collect my cousin's debts. Tell him to present himself." Bridget shrank back behind the pillar. The woman's arrogance made her stomach turn. She tried to step away quietly. Her boot scraped against a loose piece of stone. Victoria's head snapped up. Her green eyes locked onto the upper gallery. "Who is skulking up there?" Victoria asked. She pointed a gloved finger toward the shadows. "Come down." Bridget froze. The old instincts screamed at her to run back to the kitchens and hide among the soot. But the guards were watching. The Eastern Knights were watching. She swallowed hard. She gripped the wooden banister and began the slow, uneven descent down the grand staircase. Her limp was pronounced. She had to take the steps one at a time, bringing her left foot down to join her right before moving again. Victoria watched the painful progress with a sneer. "A servant?" Victoria scoffed, turning back to the guard captain. "This is how you greet guests now. You send cripples to spy from the rafters." Bridget reached the bottom step. She kept her chin tucked to her chest, her hands clasped tightly together. "I apologize, my lady," Bridget whispered. The words tumbled out by reflex. "Speak up, girl." Victoria stepped closer. She looked Bridget up and down, taking in the plain blue wool. "You wear fine cloth for a scullery rat. Did you steal that from my cousin's chests when the castle fell?" "No, my lady. It was given to me," Victoria laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound. "Given? By whom? The new master of the house?" Victoria mocked. "Robert must be truly desperate if he is taking kitchen trash to his bed." The words hit Bridget like a physical blow. The heat rushed to her cheeks. She bent her good knee, preparing to sink into a deep, submissive curtsy. It was the only way she knew to survive the wrath of a noble. "Do not bend your knee." The voice did not shout, it did not echo, it simply dropped into the hall with the weight of an anvil. Everyone turned toward the eastern archway. Robert stood there. He wore dark leather armor stained with forged soot. A broadsword hung casually from his hip. He looked at Bridget. His amber eyes held no anger toward her, only a firm, steady command. Bridget stopped halfway down. She forced her shaking legs to straighten. Robert shifted his gaze to Victoria. The air in the room grew noticeably colder. "Robert," Victoria smiled, though her eyes remained hard. "You survived the winter. The Eastern Lords sent me to verify the rumors." "You have verified them," Robert said. He walked slowly across the hall. He did not stop in front of the noblewoman. He walked past her entirely. He reached the bottom of the staircase and stood beside Bridget. "You are trespassing, Victoria," Robert stated. He kept his voice low. "My family holds the river tolls." "You need our silver to rebuild this ruin," Victoria countered. She crossed her arms. "I expect a guest room and a proper audience." "You expect respect because you wear silk," Robert replied. He reached out and placed his large hand gently on Bridget's shoulder. The heat of his palms sank through the blue wool. "But you just insulted the Lady of Blackrock." Victoria blinked. She looked from Robert to the trembling girl, genuine confusion crossing her face. "Lady?" "Robert, she has dirt under her fingernails." "She is a maid." "She is my ward," Robert corrected. He stepped forward, putting himself between Bridget and the Eastern Knights. "She holds more authority in this hall than any lord of the river, and you will address her with the respect she has earned." The knights behind Victoria shifted uneasily. They had come to test a recovering man. They found a warlord ready to strike. "I will not bow to a peasant," Victoria hissed. Her pride refused to let her back down. "Then you not walk out of this castle," Robert said. He drew his sword. The steel hissed cleanly against the leather scabbard. He did not raise it. He simply let the heavy blade rest against the stone floor. "Apologize to Bridget, or I will send your head back to the Eastern Lords in a wooden box." The silence in the great hall was heavy. Only the crackle of the hearth fires and the steady drumming of the spring rain broke the quiet. Victoria stared at the heavy broadsword resting on the stone floor. The polished steel caught the torchlight. Her knights did not move. They kept their hands away from their weapons. They knew Robert's history. They knew he had slaughtered men for far less than an insult. A muscle twitched in Victoria's jaw. The pale skin of her neck flushed red with suppressed fury. She turned her gaze slowly away from the blade and looked up at the stairs. Bridget stood near the bottom step. Her hands gripped the wooden banister so tightly her knuckles were white. "I apologize," Victoria said. The words were forced through her teeth, harsh and hollow. "I misspoke, Lady Bridget." Robert sheathed his sword. The metal hissed sharply in the quiet room. "Leave Blackrock," Robert ordered. He did not look at Victoria again. Tell the lords of the river that the winter is over. I will expect their delayed taxes by the next moon. If they refuse, I will come for them myself." Victoria pulled her velvet hood back over blonde braids. She spun on her heel and marched toward the heavy oak doors. Her knights followed quickly behind her. The heavy doors closed with a loud thud. The draft vanished. Bridget released her grip on the banister. Her bad leg trembled violently, and she sank down onto the wooden step. She felt sick. Her chest was tight. Robert walked to the base of the stairs and looked down at her. "I made you an enemy," Bridget whispered. She stared at the stone floor. "She will return to the east and tell them you are defending a scullery maid. They will rally against you." "They were already rallying," Robert replied. His voice was calm. "Victoria came here to see if I was weak. She wanted to know if the cage had broken my mind." He sat down on the step beside her. The wood groaned under his weight. "You did not create a new war, Bridget. You simply gave me a reason to end their insolence early." Bridget shook her head. The old instincts were too loud. "I do not belong in the gallery, Your Grace. I should not wear this dress." "You belong where I say you belong," Robert stated. He did not raise his voice, but the finality in his tone left no room for argument. "Do not apologize for existing." He stood up. "Rest in your rooms today. The maester will bring you a salve for your knee." He turned and walked toward the armory doors, leaving her alone on the stairs. That evening, the storm finally broke. The thick clouds parted, revealing a cold, clear night sky. Bridget paced in front of the fireplace in her bedchamber. She could not sleep. Victoria's mocking laughter still echoed in her ears. A heavy knock sounded at the door. She stopped pacing. "Come in." The heavy door swung open. Robert stood in the threshold. He wore a simple black linen shirt and dark trousers. The suit from the forge was gone, but he still carried the scent of wood smoke and old leather. He looked at her. He saw the nervous wringing of her hands and the tired lines around her eyes. "Walk with me," he said. Bridget nodded. She grabbed her thick wool shawl from the back of a chair and wrapped it around her shoulders. She followed him out into the corridor. They walked toward the eastern wing of the keep. The path led to a narrow, spiraling stone staircase. It climbed up to the highest watchtower of Blackrock. Robert started up the steps. He took 2 at a time. Bridget followed. Her bad leg ached with the effort. She had to place her right foot, pull her weight up, and drag her left foot behind. Robert heard the uneven scraping of her boots. He stopped on the landing. He did not offer his hand or make a show of pity. He simply waited. When she reached his step, he resumed the climb at half his previous pace. They reached the top of the tower. The wind off the mountains was sharp. It whipped Bridget's dark hair across her face. She stepped onto the open stone platform. The view was staggering. The entire northern valley stretched out below them. The moonlight turned the distant river into a ribbon of silver. In the fields just beyond the castle walls, hundreds of small campfires burned brightly. "My western banners," Robert said. He stood at the edge of the stone parapet, looking down at the fires. They arrived this afternoon. Bridget stood beside him. The top of her head barely reached the center of his chest. "They look like stars fallen to the earth," she murmured. "They are men ready to bleed," Robert corrected. He turned his head to look at her. "And they will fight anyone who challenges this keep." He leaned his back against the stone wall. The wind did not seem to affect him. "You look at the floor when you walk, Bridget," he noted. Bridget frowned. "It is a habit. Mistress Martha used to strike us if we made eye contact with our betters." "A habit meant to keep you alive in the kitchen," Robert said. "But it will get you killed in the court. A bowed head invites a blade to the neck." "I have no enemies," she argued softly. "You are my ward. That makes you a target." Robert reached to his leather belt. He unfastened a small and dark object and held it out to her. It was a dagger. It was not a decorative piece meant for a nobleman's belt. It was a practical weapon. The handle was wrapped in dark, rough leather for a firm grip. The sheath was simple, unadorned iron. Bridget stared at it. She did not raise her hands. "I cannot use a blade," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. "I only know how to hold a paring knife for vegetables." "You held a heavy steel skewer in a freezing storm," Robert reminded her. "You used it to break solid iron chains. You can hold a knife." He pressed the weapon into her hands. It felt heavy for its size. The leather was still warm from his body. "Draw it," he instructed. Bridget gripped the sheath with her left hand. She wrapped her right fingers around the hilt. She pulled. The blade slid out with a soft rasp. It was 5 inches long, forged from dark steel, and sharpened to a lethal edge. "Your grip is wrong," Robert said. He stepped behind her. He did not crowd her, but she could feel the solid heat of his broad chest at her back. He reached over her shoulder. His large, calloused hand covered her small one. "Do not hold it like a tool," he instructed. His deep voice resonated right beside her ear. "Wrap your thumb over the cross guard, lock your wrist." He adjusted her fingers gently but firmly. The contrast between his massive, scarred hands and her pale, thin fingers was stark in the moonlight. "If someone speaks down to you, Bridget, you look them in the eyes," Robert said. He tipped his hand over hers, holding the blade steady in the cold air. "If they threaten you, you remember that you have teeth." He stepped back, leaving her holding the drawn dagger alone. Bridget looked at the sharp steel. The trembling in her hand had stopped. The weight of the weapon felt grounding. "I do not want to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Robert replied. He looked out over the valley again. "But we do not always get to choose our wars. We only choose how we stand when they arrive." Bridget carefully slid the dagger back into its iron sheath. She clutched it tightly against her chest. She looked up at the king. The fear that had gripped her since Victoria's arrival was fading. It was replaced by a strange, quiet resolve. "Thank you," she whispered. Robert did not smile, but the hard lines of his face softened. "Keep it close," he said. "Tomorrow you will join me at the high table for the evening meal. You will wear the dagger on your belt, and you will not look at the floor." Bridget nodded once. She slipped the weapon into the deep pocket of her wooled skirt. The wind howled through the stone battlements. It was cold, but for the first time in her life, Bridget felt truly armed against it. The great hall smelled of roasted venison and spilled ale. Wood smoke hung low in the air, drifting slowly toward the blackened ceiling beams. Bridget paused behind the heavy oak doors. She wore a dark crimson dress. The maester had found the garment in the eastern stores earlier that afternoon. A thin leather belt wrapped around her waist. The iron-sheathed dagger hung at her side. Its solid weight tapped gently against her hip with every step. She pushed the doors open. The noise of 100 rough voices washed over her. Dozens of Western banner lords sat at the long wooden tables. These men wore boiled leather and carried broadswords. They were scarred veterans of Robert's past campaigns. They drank heavily and laughed loud. Bridget stepped into the light. Her limp forced her to walk slowly down the center aisle. Conversations died as she passed. Men turned their heads. Some stared with open curiosity. Others scowled. They knew she was the kitchen maid who had fed Robert. They also knew a maid did not belong at the high table. Robert sat in a high-backed wooden chair at the front of the room. He watched her approach. He did not smile, but he inclined his head slightly. A second chair sat empty beside his right hand. Bridget reached the dais. She climbed the 2 stone steps. She gripped the back of the wooden chair and pulled it out. She sat down, keeping her back straight. Highford sat to Robert's left. He was a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a missing left eye. He chewed on a piece of dark meat, glaring openly at Bridget. "We ride for the Eastern Marches in 3 days," Highford said. He slammed his pewter mug onto the table. "We need to discuss supply lines, not entertain the servants." The hall grew very quiet. Highford commanded respect among the Western lords. His challenge was public and deliberate. Robert picked up his wine cup. He took a slow drink. He set the cup down carefully. "Bridget is not a servant, Highford," Robert said. "She sits where I bid her sit." Highford leaned forward. "My king, I bled for your father. I will bleed for you. But the men talk. Victoria of House of Ants rides east, spreading tales. She says you have lost your teeth and keep a crippled pet." Bridget felt a cold spike of panic in her chest. Her hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to lower her head. She wanted to stare at the grain of the wooden table and wait for the storm to pass. A bowed head invites a blade to the neck. Robert's voice echoed in her mind. She felt the heavy iron dagger resting against her thigh. She took a sharp breath. She lifted her chin and looked directly into Highford's single, scarred eye. "Victoria speaks from wounded pride," Bridget said. Her voice wavered on the first word, but she forced it steady. Highford blinked. He clearly had not expected her to speak. Is that so, girl? Halford sneered. It is, Bridget replied. She placed her hands flat on the table where everyone could see them. She did not hide them in her lap. She came to this hall expecting to find weakness. She found the king ready for war. She left with a bruised ego, so she spreads lies to comfort herself. Halford narrowed his eye. He studied her pale face. He looked down at the iron hilt of the dagger on her belt. A bold tongue for a scullery maid, Halford grunted. A true tongue, Robert interjected. His voice carried clearly across the silent hall. You worry about morale, Halford. You worry the Eastern lords will think me weak. Robert stood up. He looked out over the crowded tables. I spent 3 months freezing in an iron cage. The lords of the river did nothing. You, my western banners, were scattered. Robert pointed a thick finger toward the table. This woman walked past armed guards to feed me. She stood in a winter storm to bring me steel. She fought a fever that nearly stopped her heart. He turned his amber eyes back to Halford. She possesses more courage in her bad leg than Victoria possesses in her entire bloodline. If any man in this hall doubts her place, let him draw his steel now. No one moved. The clinking of armor ceased. Halford stared at the table, his jaw tight. Good, Robert said. He sat back down. Now, we discuss the supply lines, Halford. You will secure the grain carts from the lower valleys. The heavy tension broke. Men returned to their meals. The low hum of conversation resumed across the hall. Bridget released a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Robert reached under the table. His rough fingers found her hand and squeezed it once. It was a brief, grounding touch. You held his gaze, Robert murmured. He kept his eyes focused on the map unrolled before him. I was terrified, she whispered back. Courage is not the absence of terror, Bridget. It is acting in spite of it. The meal continued. Bridget did not eat much, but she kept her head up. She watched the men argue over troop movements and river crossings. She did not understand the strategies, but she listened closely. Later that night, the hall emptied. The servants came to clear the wooden tables. Bridget stood up from her chair. Her leg ached deeply from the tension. Halford lingered near the hearth fires. He watched Robert issue final orders to his captains near the archway. When Robert stepped away, Halford walked toward Bridget. She tensed. Her hand instinctively drifted toward the dagger on her belt. Halford stopped a few paces away. He did not look angry. He looked exhausted. You have his ear, Halford said gruffly. I am his ward, Bridget replied. She kept her voice even. He rides east soon. The river lords are marshalling a heavy force. Halford rubbed his gray beard. He fights recklessly since the cage. He fights like a man who expects to die. Bridget frowned. He is preparing to win. Winning and surviving are two different things in war, Halford said. He looked her directly in the eye. He listens to you. Make him understand that Blackrock needs a living king, not a dead legend. Halford gave a stiff, awkward nod that resembled a bow. He turned and walked out of the hall. Bridget watched him leave. The heavy oak doors closed behind him. She looked back toward the high table. Robert stood under the torchlight, reviewing a parchment map. His face was a hard mask of focus and strategy. Halford was right. Robert had brought fire and ruin to his enemies, but he still carried the cold shadows of the iron cage within him. Bridget walked back to Robert. He rolled the parchment map and tied it with a leather string. Halford challenged you again? Robert asked. He did not look up. No, Bridget said. She stopped beside the wooden table. He asked me to protect you. Robert paused. He looked at her. A genuine, confused frown creased his forehead. Protect me? He says you fight recklessly. He says you fight like a man who expects to die. Robert scoffed. He tossed the map onto the table. Halford is an old man. He worries about the winter cold and eastern arrows. I have survived worse. Surviving is not living, Bridget said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Robert stepped closer to her. The torchlight cast long shadows across his face. I am breathing, he said quietly. But you are still in the cage, she whispered. Robert did not answer immediately. He looked at her dark hair, her pale face, and the steady resolve in her eyes. The timid kitchen maid was gone. A different kind of steel was taking her place. "We ride in 3 days," Robert said finally. "I will return." "You must," Bridget replied. She rested her hand on the hilt of her dagger. "Because if you fall, I will have to use this weapon. And I still do not like holding it." A faint, rare smile touched Robert's lips. "Then, I suppose I must not fall." The morning air bit cold. Mist clung to the lower valley. Hundreds of horses stamped in the courtyard. Armor clanked as men mounted. Robert stood near the main gate. He wore a steel breastplate over his leather tunic. Hafford waited on a roan stallion nearby, holding the royal banner. Bridget stood on the stone steps. She pulled her wool shawl tight against the damp wind. Robert walked over to her. He stopped on the bottom step, looking up. "The western passes are secure," Robert said. "The guard captain answers to you. Do not let him make excuses. If men slack in their duties, punish them." "I will manage the stores," Bridget replied. "We have enough grain for 2 months, provided the damp does not reach the lower cellars. Keep the gates barred at sunset." Robert reached out. He touched her cheek. His calloused fingers brushed against her skin. "I will return," he stated. It was a vow. "I will hold the keep," she promised. Robert turned away. He swung into his saddle. He spurred his horse forward. The heavy gates opened and the army marched out. Bridget watched until the last banner disappeared into the fog. Silence settled over Blackrock Castle. It felt hollow without the soldiers. Bridget did not retreat to the library. She turned and walked toward the lower levels. She entered the kitchens. The heat from the hearth fires hit her immediately. The staff froze. Pots stopped clattering. A new head cook stood by the washing basins. He bowed quickly. Bridget ignored the silence. She inspected the pantries. She knew these rooms intimately. She knew where water seeped through the floorboards. She knew how rats accessed the flour bins. "Move the barley to the upper shelves," Bridget instructed. She pointed to a stack of burlap sacks. "The floor stones sweat during the spring rains. The rot will set in by next week." The cook blinked, surprised by her practical knowledge. "Yes, my lady." "And rotate the salted pork," she added. "The cuts in the back corner are drawing flies. Use them for the guard's stew tonight." She worked through the afternoon. She audited the meat stores. She counted the winter squash. The servants stopped staring and started working. She spoke their language. She did not yell, but she expected diligence. She earned their compliance not through fear, but through competence. 5 days passed. Tension grew within the castle walls. Everyone waited for a raven from the eastern front. Bridget struggled to sleep. Her knee throbbed in the quiet hours. She walked the corridors at night. Clara walked beside her. The young maid carried an oil lantern to light the uneven stones. They reached the southern storage wing. It housed the main grain silos. The air here usually smelled of dry dust and old wood. Tonight, it smelled of lamp oil. Bridget stopped. She raised her hand. Clara halted immediately. A faint scraping sound echoed from the end of the hall. "Stay here," Bridget whispered. Clara shook her head. Her eyes were wide with fear. Bridget took the lantern from the girl. She stepped forward, alone. Her bad leg dragged slightly, but she masked the sound beneath the rustle of her wool dress. She reached the wooden door of the silo. It stood slightly ajar. Bridget pushed the door open. A man knelt by the grain sacks. He poured liquid from a clay jug over the burlap. He held a flint and steel in his right hand. Bridget recognized him. He was a stable hand named Fenn. He had arrived with Victoria's knights and stayed behind, claiming a fever. "Stop," Bridget commanded. Fenn jumped. He dropped the jug. It shattered on the stone floor. The smell of oil filled the enclosed space. He spun around. He saw Bridget standing in the doorway, holding the lantern. His tense posture relaxed. He smirked. "The kitchen rat," Fenn sneered. He stood up. He drew a short knife from his belt. "Lady Victoria said you were a weak link. She paid me to starve Robert's garrison."
Bridget felt her heart pound against her ribs. Her mouth went dry. She did not step back. She set the lantern on the ground. She reached to her belt, her fingers wrapped around the leather hilt of her dagger. She drew the weapon. The steel hissed cleanly. "Step away from the grain," Bridget said. Her voice did not shake. Fen laughed. He took a step forward, twirling his knife. "You don't know how to use that, girl. Drop it. I might let you live." He lunged. Bridget moved. She did not try to match his speed. Her bad leg made dodging impossible. Instead, she dropped her weight onto her good knee. She twisted her torso away from his thrust. Friends bathed dayliced empty air. He lost his balance. Bridget slashed upward. Her dagger caught his forearm. The sharp steel bit deep into flesh. Fen yelled. He dropped his knife. He clutched his bleeding arm and stumbled backward. Bridget kicked his fallen weapon across the floor. She stood up and leveled her dagger at his chest. "Do not move," she ordered. She locked her wrist, just as Robert had taught her. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. 2 guards rushed into the room with swords drawn. They had heard Fen's shout. They saw the spilled oil. They saw the bleeding spy. They saw Bridget holding the dagger with a steady hand. "My lady," the first guard gasped. "Are you hurt?" "No," Bridget replied. She sheathed her dagger. She pointed at Fen. "He tried to burn the grain stores. Lock him in the lower cells. Do not let him speak to anyone."
The guards grabbed Fen roughly. They dragged him out of the room. Clara peeked into the silo. She stared at Bridget with pure awe. "Bring sand," Bridget told the maid. "We must cover the oil before it ruins the bottom sacks." Bridget picked up the lantern. Her hand trembled slightly now that the danger had passed, but her mind remained clear. She had defended the keep. She had shed blood to protect Robert's resources. She was no longer just waiting in the shadows. She was ruling Blackrock. The lower dungeons smelled of rust and stagnant water. Torches sputtered in iron brackets, casting long shadows across the uneven floor. Bridget stood before the heavy iron bars of the holding cell. Captain Thorne stood beside her. He held a ring of large keys. Blood stained his leather gauntlets from dragging the prisoner downstairs. "He refuses to speak," Thorne said. "We can apply physical pressure. If you command it, he is a traitor." Bridget shook her head. "Open the door." Thorne hesitated. He looked at her blue dress and her pale face, but the memory of her bloody dagger remained fresh in his mind. He turned the key. The hinges groaned. Fen sat on the damp stones. Dirt streaked his face. A rough linen bandage wrapped his right forearm where Bridget had cut him. He glared at her. Bridget stepped inside the cell. She carried a wooden cup of water. She set it on the ground near his heavy boots. "Drink," she said. Fen kicked the cup away. Water splashed against the cold stone. "You play the high lady," Fen spat, "but you still smell like the pigsties. You don't know how to conduct a war." Bridget did not flinch. She crossed her arms. "You burned the grain because you thought we would starve. But an invading army needs that grain to survive a siege. Victoria does not plan to occupy Blackrock." Fen's eyes darted toward the open door. He closed his mouth tightly. "She plans to raise it," Bridget continued. Her voice remained even and calm. "And she can only do that if Robert is dead. Where is the ambush?" "He is already a corpse," Fen laughed. A desperate edge cracked his voice. "The western banners marched straight down the King's Road. They expect a pitched battle at the river crossing. But my lady's brother took 2,000 archers into the drowned pass." Bridget felt her stomach drop. She had seen the map in the library. The drowned pass was a narrow, steep ravine. It offered no cover. "They will trap him," Fen smiled. He leaned his head against the damp wall. "And then they will come for you." Bridget turned her back on him. She walked out of the cell. "Give him no more water until he begs," she told Thorne. She hurried up the spiraling stone stairs. Her bad leg ached with every step, but she ignored the pain. She had to reach the library. The library fire crackled in the hearth. Rain lashed against the tall glass windows. Thorne followed her inside. 3 other lieutenants joined them. They stood around the polished oak table, waiting for her command. Bridget unrolled the parchment map. She placed an iron weight on one corner to keep it flat. "Robert is marching here," she pointed to the winding blue line of the river. But the eastern archers wait in the Jount Pass. Thorn leaned over the map. He frowned deeply. If they hold the high ridges, our cavalry cannot charge. The horses will panic. It will be a slaughter. We must warn him, Bridget said. Our orders are to hold the castle, a young lieutenant argued. He pointed to the thick walls of Blackrock on the map. We only have 200 men left. If we send riders, we leave the gates vulnerable to a secondary attack. Bridget looked at the young man. A stone wall protects nothing if the army shatters. Victoria will starve us out in a month. We die either way. She turned to Thorn. How many light cavalry can you muster in an hour? Thorn calculated silently. He traced a path on the map with his armored finger. 50. We have fast horses, but we lack heavy armor for a sustained fight. You do not need heavy armor to ride fast, Bridget said. You only need to reach Robert before he enters the ravine. Tell him to flank the ridges from the northern trail. Thorn stared at her. He weighed his strict duty to Robert's past orders against the logic of the woman standing before him. He saw no panic in her eyes. He only saw a cold, practical resolve. I will lead them myself, Thorn decided. Who will command the castle guard? The lieutenant asked. I will, Bridget stated. The men fell silent. They looked at her plain wool dress and her uneven stance. They were seasoned soldiers. She was a former scullery maid. But they also saw the iron dagger hanging on her belt, the same blade that had saved their winter stores. Arm the kitchen staff, Bridget commanded. She tapped the map. Give them spears and crossbows. I know how they work under pressure. They will hold the inner courtyards. Thorn nodded. He struck his fist against his breastplate. As you command, my lady. The courtyard erupted into frantic movement. Men saddled horses and loaded leather supply packs. Bridget stood on the high gallery. She pulled her shawl tight against the biting wind. She watched Thorn mount his black gelding. The 50 riders formed a tight column behind him. They rode out through the iron gates. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut immediately behind them. The iron bars fell into place with a loud, final thud. Blackrock held only a skeleton crew now. Bridget walked down the grand staircase and headed straight for the armory. The armory smelled of oil and sharpened steel. Racks of weapons lined the stone walls. She found Clara struggling to lift a heavy wooden shield. The young maid's arms shook under the weight. Bridget took the shield from the girl. She set it against the wall. You do not need this, Bridget said. She handed Clara a loaded crossbow. It was much lighter. You just need to point and pull the trigger. Keep your elbows tucked. The servants gathered in the main hall. Cooks, stable hands, and maids held unfamiliar weapons. Some carried hunting bows. Others held simple iron pikes. Their faces showed raw terror. Bridget walked to the center of the room. She stepped up onto a sturdy wooden crate so they could see her. She looked at the faces she had known for years. She saw the old baker who used to sneak her extra crusts of bread. She saw the washerwoman who had bandaged her bruised arms. I have scrubbed these floors with you, Bridget said. Her voice echoed off the high stone ceiling. I have bled in these halls. I know you are afraid. The room remained perfectly still. They listened. The Eastern lords think we are weak because we do not wear polished steel, she continued. They think a castle belongs to the highborn. She drew her dagger. She held the dark steel up in the torchlight. They are wrong. This keep does not belong to lords who hide in distant towers. It belongs to the people who survive its winters. It belongs to the hands that keep the fires burning. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Men gripped their iron pikes tighter. Robert marches to secure our borders. We will secure his home, Bridget declared. If Victoria's forces reach these walls, we do not surrender. We hold the gates. The fear in their eyes shifted. It hardened into a grim, unyielding determination. They did not cheer like trained soldiers. They simply nodded. Bridget stepped down from the crate. She sheared her dagger. She had committed her remaining forces. She had defied a king's direct order to save his life. She had armed the lowest class of the castle. She walked toward the heavy oak doors of the great hall. Her limp was noticeable, but she did not try to hide it. She climbed the spiral stairs back to the highest watchtower. The wind howled through the stone battlements. She looked out over the dark, empty valley.
The die was cast. Now she could only wait for the war to return to her doorstep. The drowned pass was a jagged scar in the earth. Steep granite walls rose on both sides, blocking the afternoon sun. Robert rode at the head of the western column. He held the reins loosely in his left hand. The air felt unnaturally still in the ravine. No birds called from the sparse pine trees. Hafford rode beside him, eyeing the rocky ridges. "The scouts report nothing, my king," Hafford grunted, "but the horses are restless." Robert nodded. He felt the same tension in his own gut. He signaled the column to halt. Before he could order the scouts forward again, the rhythmic thud of galloping hooves echoed from the rear of the column. Thorn's black gilding crested the rocky incline. The horse foamed at the mouth, its chest heaving. Thorn pulled hard on the reins. The horse slid to a halt before Robert. "Captain Thorn," Robert said. He frowned. "I ordered you to hold the castle." Thorn saluted breathlessly. "Lady Bridget countermanded your order. She uncovered a spy in the grain stores. She sent us to warn you." Thorn pointed a leather-clad finger toward the high ridges overlooking the pass. 2,000 Eastern archers wait ahead. Lady Victoria's brother commands them. Robert stared at Thorn. The intelligence clashed with his previous scout reports, but Bridget had spent her life surviving by noticing what others ignored. He trusted her instincts over his own scouts. A horn blew from the eastern ridge. Lord Jance realized the western column had stopped. He knew his ambush was compromised. He sprang the trap early. A volley of arrows darkened the narrow strip of sky. They rained down on the vanguard with a terrifying whistle. Men shouted in surprise, horses reared, throwing their riders into the dirt. The old Robert would have drawn his sword and charged the cliffs. He would have welcomed the slaughter, hoping an arrow might finally silence the lingering ghosts of the iron cage. But Thorn's words echoed in his mind. "Lady Bridget sent us." She had defied a direct royal command. She had stripped Blackrock of its cavalry. She had done it solely to keep him breathing. Robert grabbed Thorn's reins to steady the exhausted horse. He turned in his saddle. "Shield wall!" Robert roared, his voice cut through the panic. "Fall back to the tree line! Lock your shields!" The Western infantry responded to his voice. They raised their heavy wooden shields, interlocking the iron rims. Arrows clattered harmlessly against the makeshift roof. The dissolute retreat saved hundreds of lives in the first brutal minute. "Hafford!" Robert called out. The old general spurred his horse closer, deflecting a stray arrow with his gauntlet. "Take the cavalry," Robert ordered. He pointed his broadsword toward a narrow goat trail snaking up the northern side of the ravine. "Flank the ridge. They are focused on the pass. Break their lines from behind. I will hold their attention here." Hafford grinned. His single eye flashed at anticipation. "Yes, my king." The battle joined in earnest. Robert dismounted. He stood at the front of the shield wall. He deflected incoming fire and directed his archers to return volleys. He fought with cold, calculating precision. He did not fight to die, he fought to finish the war so he could ride home. Darkness covered Blackrock Castle. The wind whipped across the stone battlements, carrying the scent of incoming rain. Bridget paced the eastern wall. Her dark wool cloak snapped in the wind. She checked the crossbows of the kitchen boys. Their hands shook in the cold. "Keep your eyes on the tree line," Bridget told them. She kept her voice steady. Clara stood near a brazier of hot coals. She held a long iron poker. The young maid jumped at every shifting shadow. "They might not come, my lady," Clara whispered. "Victoria left a spy to burn the food," Bridget replied. She looked out over the moat. "She planned to starve the survivors. That means she expects her forces to take the walls tonight." A sharp, metallic clink broke the silence. It came from the postern gate below, a small entrance usually reserved for servants. Bridget leaned over the stone parapet. 3 iron grappling hooks dug deeply into the mortar. Thick hemp ropes pulled taut immediately. A vanguard of Eastern mercenaries was scaling the wall. They wore dark leather and carried short swords in their teeth. They expected an empty castle commanded by a frightened maid. Bridget drew her dagger. She struck the steel against the stone parapet to spark a signal. "To the wall!" Bridget shouted. The servants rushed forward. They pointed their loaded crossbows down into the darkness. "Fire!" Iron bolts whistled through the cold air. A man screamed. He lost his grip on the rope and fell heavily into the dark water of the moat. But others kept climbing. They moved fast, driven by the promise of easy plunder. An Eastern mercenary crested the wall. He swung his short sword, knocking a stable hand to the stone floor. The man snarled and lunged toward Clara. Bridget moved. She did not hesitate, and she did not call for guards that were not there. She threw herself forward. Her bad leg buckled slightly, but she used the forward momentum. She drove her dagger upward, aiming for the unarmored gap beneath the mercenary's shoulder guard. The dark steel bit deep. The man grunted in shock. He dropped his sword. Bridget shoved him hard with her good shoulder. The mercenary lost his footing on the slick stones and tumbled backward over the parapet. "Cut the ropes," Bridget ordered. She pulled her dagger free and stepped back. The old baker rushed forward. He swung a heavy meat cleaver down on the taut hemp. The ropes snapped with a loud crack. Shouts of panic echoed from the dark as the remaining climbers fell. Silence returned to the wall. Only the heavy breathing of the servants broke the quiet. Bridget wiped a smear of dirt from her cheek. She looked at the kitchen boys and the maids. None of them were seriously hurt. They stared at her, their eyes wide with a new, profound respect. They had held the wall. Down in the courtyard, the heavy iron bell in the watchtower began to toll. Bridget turned sharply. That bell was only rung by the gatekeeper. "Riders approach!" the gatekeeper shouted from the front towers. Bridget hurried down the spiraling stone stairs. Her leg throbbed violently, but adrenaline masked the worst of the pain. She crossed the courtyard as the heavy wooden doors groaned open. Thorn rode through the gates. His black gilding was covered in mud and sweat. A dozen light cavalry followed him. Bridget stopped in the center of the yard. She waited for Thorn to dismount. Thorn walked toward her. He looked exhausted, his armor dented and scored by arrows. He stopped a respectful distance away and bowed deeply. "The ambush was broken, my lady," Thorn reported. "King Robert flanked their archers. The eastern vanguard is scattered." Relief washed over Bridget. It was so intense her knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the edge of a wooden wagon to steady herself. "And the king?" she asked softly. "He took the main army toward the river to press the advantage," Thorn said. "He ordered me to return and reinforce the castle." Thorn looked up at the eastern battlements. He saw the severed ropes dangling from the stones. He saw the baker holding a bloody meat cleaver. The captain looked back at Bridget. He noticed the fresh blood on the blade of her drawn dagger. "It seems you did not need my reinforcement, Lady Bridget," Thorn observed quietly. Bridget sheathed her dagger. She stood straight. "Secure the postern gate, Captain," she said. "The night is not over." 3 days passed. The tension in Blackrock eased into a dull exhaustion. Bridget organized the repair of the eastern wall. She assigned extra rations to the kitchen staff who had fired the crossbows. They ate roasted pork usually reserved for captains. She slept very little. A horn sounded on the 4th morning. It was a long, steady note of victory. Bridget walked to the courtyard. She stood on the upper stone steps. The heavy gates swung open. Robert rode through first. His steel breastplate bore deep gouges. Dirt and dried blood stained his dark cloak. He looked tired, but his amber eyes were clear. The heavy shadow of the iron cage was gone. Halford rode behind him. The Western cavalry followed. They brought wagons of captured weapons and supplies. Then came the prisoners. A dozen Eastern knights walked in heavy chains. Victoria walked among them. Her velvet cloak was torn at the hem. Mud covered her expensive boots. She kept her head high, but her face was pale. She looked around the grim fortress with wide eyes. The Western lords cheered. Servants gathered near the armory doors to watch. Robert dismounted. He handed his reins to a stable hand. He did not look at Halford. He ignored the captive knights. He walked straight toward the stone steps. Bridget met his gaze. She did not lower her head. She noted the weariness in his stride, but he walked like a man who owned the earth beneath his feet. Robert stopped on the bottom step. He reached up and touched her arm. His leather gauntlet was cold, but his grip was firm. "You held the keep," he said. "You broke the ambush," Bridget replied. "Because you sent Thorn," Robert stated. He turned and faced the noisy courtyard. "Bring Victoria forward," Robert commanded. 2 guards grabbed Victoria by the arms. They dragged her to the center of the yard. They forced her to her knees in the mud. Victoria sneered. She looked up at Robert. You won a single battle. You have not won the war. The River Lords will send another army. The River Lords surrendered yesterday, Robert said. His voice echoed off the stone walls. Your brother died in the pass. Your captains bent the knee. You have nothing left. Victoria swallowed hard. Panic flashed in her green eyes. She looked at the armed men surrounding her. She looked at Halford, who watched her with cold indifference. Finally, she looked at Bridget. You will not kill me, Victoria said. She lifted her chin. Her voice shook slightly. I am of House Vance. I carry noble blood. You cannot let a peasant dictate my fate. Robert drew his broadsword. The steel slid free with a sharp hiss. Victoria flinched. She closed her eyes. Robert did not strike. He turned the blade around. He held the heavy weapon by the polished steel, offering the leather hilt to Bridget. Bridget stared at the sword. She insulted you in my eye, Robert said. He kept his voice loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. She paid a spy to burn your food. She expected you to die. Her fate belongs to you. Bridget looked at the weapon. It was too large for her to swing with one hand. She reached out and grasped the hilt with both hands. The steel was cold. Robert stepped back. He left her standing alone above the kneeling prisoner. Halford crossed his arms. Thorne watched closely. The entire tassel waited to see what she would do with absolute power. Victoria opened her eyes. She stared at the heavy blade in Bridget's trembling hands. The noble woman's arrogance finally cracked. She visibly shook. Please, Victoria whispered. The word barely left her lips.
Bridget stepped down. Her bad leg made the movement slow, but she kept her balance. She stopped one pace away from Victoria. She remembered the cruel laugh in the gallery. She remembered the fear of the scullery. She remembered Fen holding the knife in the dark silo. Bridget lifted the broadsword. Her shoulders ached from the sheer weight of the metal. She did not swing the edge. She brought the flat of the heavy blade down hard against Victoria's shoulder. Victoria cried out in pain. She collapsed sideways into the mud. Bridget drove the point of the sword deep into the earth. She leaned heavily on the crossguard. I will not kill you, Bridget said. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet yard. Blood feeds the earth, but it does not rebuild a castle. Victoria gasped for air. She clutched her bruised shoulder. You are stripped of your titles, Bridget declared. House Vance no longer holds the river tolls. You will leave this valley. You will walk east. You will not take a horse, and you will not take a cloak. Bridget looked around the courtyard. She met Halford's single eye. She looked at Thorne. If she is found within our borders again, any man here has my permission to hang her. Bridget pulled the sword from the mud. She turned and walked back up the steps. She handed the weapon back to Robert. Take her away, Bridget ordered the guards. The guards dragged the weeping noblewoman toward the gates. The iron bars lifted. They threw Victoria out into the valley and shut the heavy wood. Robert sheathed his sword. He looked at Bridget. A deep, quiet pride settled in his amber eyes. Halford stepped forward. The old general drove his fist against his breastplate. He bowed low. A wise judgment, Lady Bridget, Halford said loudly. You spared a life, but you killed a house. It sends a stronger message than a severed head. The other captains murmured in agreement. They recognized the cold pragmatism in her choice. They did not want a reckless queen. They wanted a stable ruler. She had proven she could execute authority without losing her mind to vengeance. Bridget nodded to Halford. She felt exhausted. The adrenaline faded, leaving a sharp ache in her bones. Robert saw her posture slump slightly. He placed his hand on her lower back. Walk with me, he said. They left the courtyard. They walked into the great hall. The fires burned warm. You surprised them, Robert noted. I surprised myself, Bridget admitted. She rubbed her wrists. I wanted to strike her. For a moment, I wanted to see her bleed. That is the anger of the cage, Robert said quietly. It takes a strong mind to put the blade down. He stopped near the hearth. He looked at her plain wool dress and the iron daggers still hanging on her belt. You did not just hold the keep, Bridget. You commanded it. You armed the servants. You fought on the wall. Bridget looked at the stone floor. I did what was necessary. Robert placed 2 fingers under her chin. He lifted her face until she met his eyes. You are necessary, Robert said. He dropped his hand. He walked to the long wooden table and poured 2 cups of wine. He handed one to her. "The East is broken. The West is loyal," Robert said. He raised his cup. "Blackrock is secure." Bridget took the cup. She drank the wine. It burned her throat, but it grounded her. She was no longer the scullery maid hiding in the shadows. She had forged her own place in the stone halls. She had proven her worth to the Western banners, to the castle staff, and to the king. But as she looked at Robert, she knew the hardest battle was not fought with swords. The war outside the walls was over. The task of healing the wounds inside the castle had just begun. Weeks turned into a quiet, steady routine. Summer approached the northern valleys, melting the last stubborn patches of ice near the high peaks. Blackrock Castle transformed. The sounds of clashing steel and shouting guards gave way to the ringing of hammers and the rumble of supply wagons. Bridget took control of the household ledgers. She moved her workspace from the grand library to a practical wooden desk near the receiving hall. She tracked grain shipments, ordered fresh wool for the upcoming winter, and increased the wages of the kitchen staff. The servants no longer looked at the floor when she walked past. They offered polite nods and clear answers. Robert spent his days in the courtyard or the council chambers. He negotiated new trade agreements with the subdued river lords. He directed the stonemasons repairing the damaged eastern wall. He ruled with a firm, fair hand. During the daylight hours, he was the untouchable sovereign. But the nights told a different story. The spring rain returned heavily in the 4th week. Thunder rattled the thick glass of the high windows. Lightning flashed across the dark sky in jagged white streaks. Bridget lay awake in her bedchamber. The damp air made her bad knee throb with a dull, persistent ache. She pulled the thick wool blanket up to her chin and watched the shadows move against the wall. A loud crash echoed through the thick stone corridor. It sounded like heavy wood splintering. It came from the royal apartments down the hall. Bridget sat up. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress and pushed her feet into her leather slippers. She grabbed a heavy iron candle holder from her nightstand and lit the wick from the dying hearth embers. She opened her door and stepped into the drafty corridor. The castle was dark. The guards were stationed at the ends of the hall, too far to hear the noise over the rolling thunder. She walked toward Robert's chamber. Her uneven steps made very little sound on the woven rugs. She stopped in front of his heavy oak door. She knocked softly. No answer came. Only the sound of harsh, ragged breathing reached her ears through the thick wood. Bridget pushed the heavy iron latch. The door swung open smoothly. The room was dark. The hearth fire had burned out hours ago. A heavy wooden chair lay shattered in pieces near the center of the rug. Robert sat on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed. He wore only loose linen trousers. His bare chest heaved. Sweat slicked his skin, gleaming faintly in the dim candlelight. His elbows rested on his knees, and his large hands gripped his hair. He did not look up when the door opened. "The cold," Robert muttered. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. "It does not stop." Bridget stepped inside. She closed the door quietly behind her to block the draft. She understood immediately. He was not in the high tower. His mind was trapped in the iron cage, buried under the freezing mud of the northern courtyard. The sound of the thunderstorm had pulled him back into the dark. Bridget set the candle holder on a small wooden table. She did not call the maester. She did not shout for the guards. She walked across the room. She navigated around the broken chair and stopped directly in front of him. "Robert," she said. He flinched. His head snapped up. His amber eyes were wide, dilated, and entirely unfocused. He stared through her, seeing only the ghosts of his captivity. "They break the chain," he whispered rapidly, "but the rust is still in the bone." Bridget did not step back from his wild intensity. She closed the final distance between them. She sat down on the mattress beside him. The mattress sank under her weight. She reached out. She did not hesitate or second-guess her right to touch him. She laid her small, pale hand directly over his large, trembling knuckles. His skin was freezing. Despite the sweat, he felt like a man standing in a blizzard. "You are not in the yard," Bridget said. She kept her voice low, steady, and completely calm. Robert tensed, his muscles coiled tight. He looked down at the hand covering his. "Feel the heat," Bridget commanded softly. She pressed her palm firmer against his rigid fingers. "The mud is gone. There is no iron here."
Robert closed his eyes. He took a sharp, jagged breath. He focused on the point of contact. Her hand was small, but it radiated a fierce, grounding warmth. It was the same warmth he had memorized through the gaps of the iron bars. He turned his hand over. He gripped her fingers tightly. He did not crush her hand, but he held on as if she were the only tether keeping him from falling off a cliff. The frantic rising and falling of his chest began to slow. The wild edge left his breathing. A loud crack of thunder shook the room. Robert shuddered, but he did not pull away. He opened his eyes. The terrifying blankness was gone. He saw the silk sheets. He saw the carved wooden bedposts. He saw her. "I broke the chair," he said quietly. He looked at the splintered wood on the floor. "The carpenters will build another," Bridget replied. She did not withdraw her hand. Robert rubbed his face with his free hand. He looked incredibly tired. The invulnerable king who had shattered the Eastern army looked completely worn down by his own mind. "I dreamed of the storm," Robert admitted. He looked at the dark window. Rain hammered against the glass. "The night you brought the steel skewer, the fever took you." "The fever broke," she reminded him. "In the dream, it did not," he said. His grip on her hand tightened a fraction. "In the dream, the guards threw your body into the courtyard, and I could not break the lock in time. I watched the snow cover you." Bridget felt a sudden, tight ache in her throat. She had assumed his nightmares were about the torture, the starvation, and the betrayal of his lords. She had not realized his deepest terror centered entirely on her. "I am here," Bridget said. "You are fragile," Robert murmured. He looked at her pale face and her slight frame. "I placed you at the high table. I gave you power, but I painted a target on your back." Victoria proved that. Bridget let go of his hand. Robert looked down, a flash of loss crossing his face. But Bridget did not pull away to leave. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool skirt. She pulled out the iron-sheathed dagger he had given her on the watchtower. She placed the heavy weapon onto his lap. "I am not the girl who hid behind the pillar anymore," Bridget stated. She looked directly into his eyes. "I held this blade to a spy's throat. I stood on the wall and the mercenaries climbed the ropes." Robert looked at the dark steel resting against his leg. "You taught me how to hold it," Bridget continued. "You told me not to look at the floor. I listened." Robert slowly raised his eyes. He studied her face in the dim candlelight. The timid, submissive maid was a memory. The woman sitting beside him possessed a quiet, unbreakable iron core. "I know," Robert said. His voice dropped lower, shedding the last remnants of his panic. "Thorn told me what you did on the battlements. You drew blood to hold the gate." "I did," she confirmed. "You defied my direct order," he added. There was no anger in his tone, only a profound realization. "You sent the cavalry away. I sent them to save your life." Bridget did not lower her gaze. "If you court-martial me for it, I will accept the punishment, but I will not apologize." A long silence stretched between them. The thunder rolled away, leaving only the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. Robert reached out. He did not pick up the dagger. He lifted his hand and gently touched the side of her face. His rough thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "I would burn this entire valley before I let anyone punish you," Robert whispered. The touch was intimate, stripped of all political weight and royal titles. It was simply a man reaching for the light that had saved him from the dark. Bridget leaned slightly into his palm. She closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "The winter is over, Robert," Bridget said softly. She opened her eyes. "You do not have to fight the ghosts alone. Let the snow melt." Robert slowly exhaled. He lowered his hand, but the heavy tension in his shoulders finally released. The haunting grip of the nightmare fractured completely. "Sit with me," Robert asked. It was not a command from a king. It was a genuine plea from a man. "Until the rain stops, I will stay," Bridget promised. She did not return to her room. She pulled a willing blanket from the foot of the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. She sat back against the carved headboard, keeping vigil in the quiet dark. Robert leaned back against the pillows. He closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into the steady, peaceful rhythm of true sleep. Bridget watched the candle burn down to a stub. The storm outside eventually broke, giving way to the quiet calm of the approaching dawn. She had guarded the grain stores, and she had guarded the walls. Now she guarded his peace, and she knew she would hold this line forever. Sunlight pierced the tall library windows. Dust motes danced slowly in the warm morning air. Bridget sat at the polished oak desk. She reviewed the final inventory of the repaired grain stores. The numbers aligned down the page. She closed the heavy levy ledger and set her quill aside. Last night's storm felt distant. Robert had slept through the dawn, his breathing steady, calm. She had left his chamber before the castle woke, returning to her own room to wash and dress for the day. A knock sounded at the heavy wooden door. "Come in," Bridget said. Captain Thorne entered the room. He wore a clean uniform, free of the mud and blood from the Eastern campaign. He stood tall, offering a crisp salute. "The Western lords gather in the great hall, Lady Bridget," Thorne reported. "King Roderick requests your presence immediately." Bridget stood up. She smoothed the front of her blue wool dress. She rested her hand briefly on the iron dagger at her belt. It was a reflex now, a silent reassurance before facing a crowd. "I am ready," she replied. She followed Thorne through the stone corridors. The castle hummed with quiet, purposeful energy. Servants scrubbed floors and carried fresh linens. They offered polite bows as Bridget passed. She returned their greetings with a nod. She no longer felt the urge to grab a brush and join them on her knees.
They reached the great hall. The heavy oak doors stood wide open. The room buzzed with conversation. Sunlight streamed through the high clerestory windows, catching the polished steel of the guard's armor. Bridget walked down the center aisle. Her limp was steady, setting a measured pace. The Western banners parted to make way for her. They did not stare with suspicion or disdain anymore. They bowed their heads respectfully. Robert stood before the high table. He wore a dark tunic. A silver wolf was embroidered over his heart. He looked rested. The dark circles under his amber eyes had faded significantly. Lord Hafford stood to Robert's right. The old general tapped his sword hilt rhythmically, watching Bridget approach. She reached the stone dais. She moved toward the empty wooden chair beside Robert. "Wait," Robert said. He held up his hand. Bridget stopped. She looked at him, confused, but she held her ground. Robert turned to face the gathered lords, captains, and the castle staff who lined the walls. Clara and the old baker stood near the front row, looking nervous but proud. "We have secured our borders," Robert began. His deep voice carried effortlessly to the back of the hall. "The eastern threat is broken. The river lords pay their taxes. But a castle is not defended by stone alone." He stepped away from the table. He walked to the edge of the dais. "It is defended by the people who hold the line when the gates are threatened. The mercenaries scaled our walls. My soldiers were miles away. The cooks, the maids, and the stable hands held this keep." Robert gestured toward the servants. "Those who fought on the eastern wall will receive a silver coin today. You will also receive a permanent place in the castle guard, if you choose it." "Your bravery saved Blackrock." The hall erupted in applause. The Western lords banged their fists against the wooden tables in respect. The baker wept silently, wiping his eyes with a flour-stained rag. Clara stood taller, a bright smile on her face. Robert raised his hand again. The noise died down immediately. He turned back to Bridget. He did not look at her as a fragile ward. He looked at her as a ruler. "I left this castle with a direct command to hold the walls," Robert said. That command was defied. A ripple of tension moved through the lords. Hafford frowned, his single eye darting toward Bridget. "Lady Bridget stripped the castle of its cavalry. She sent my best riders into danger." Robert paused. He took a slow step toward her. "She did this to save my life in the Drowned Pass, and she succeeded." Robert drew his sword. The movement was slow and deliberate. He did not point it at anyone. He laid the naked steel blade flat across the wooden table. "I was a king forged in blood," Robert stated. "I ruled by fear.
I believed fear kept men loyal. The iron cage taught me that fear only breeds treason. True loyalty is not bought. It is earned through sacrifice. He looked out at the gathered crowd. His amber eyes swept over the scarred faces of his veterans.
Bridget earned her place with a stolen crust of bread in the freezing dark. She secured it with a drawn dagger on the battlements. She ruled in my absence with a steady, unyielding hand. Robert reached out. He took Bridget's small hand in his massive one. He led her past the wooden chairs, bringing her to the very center of the dais. "She is not just my ward," Robert declared. His voice rang with absolute finality. "She is the heart of Blackrock. Her word carries the exact weight of my word. Her judgment is my judgment. If you draw a blade for me, you draw it for her." Halford stepped forward immediately. He did not hesitate. The old general dropped to one knee. His heavy armor clanked loudly against the stone floor. "To the king and the lady," Halford vowed. His gruff voice echoed off the high ceiling. Thorne knelt next. Then the western lords followed, a sudden wave of sinking steel and bowing heads. The servants dropped to their knees, pressing their hands to their chests. Bridget stood before the kneeling assembly, her breath hitched in her throat. She looked down at the sea of loyal faces. The lingering fear that had defined her entire life finally evaporated. It left behind a solid, unshakable strength. She squeezed Robert's hand. He squeezed back, anchoring her to the moment. The formal assembly ended shortly after. The hall emptied slowly as the lords returned to their daily duties. The servants hurried back to the kitchens with lighter steps. Robert and Bridget walked out into the main courtyard together. The spring sun warmed the stone flags. The deep mud from the winter thaw was gone, replaced by dry, packed earth. They stopped near the center of the yard. It was the exact spot where the heavy iron cage used to stand. The rusted bolts were gone from the ground. The stonemasons had replaced the broken flagstones with fresh, smooth granite. No trace of the brutal prison remained. Robert looked down at the new stone. He did not flinch. His shoulders remained relaxed. The memories were still there, but they no longer possessed sharp teeth. The storm in his mind had finally broken. "It is gone," Bridget said softly. "Yes," Robert agreed. He looked away from the ground and turned to face her. "The nightmares will fade. You proved that last night." "I will always sit with you," Bridget promised. She let go of his hand and rested her palm against his chest, right over the silver wolf. "Through every storm." Robert reached up. He traced the line of her jaw with his rough thumb. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to his massive size. "I know," he said. He leaned down. He kissed her forehead. It was a simple, profound gesture of gratitude and deep affection. It sealed the vow they had mowed in the dark hours of the rain. Bridget closed her eyes. She leaned into his strength. She felt the steady, reliable beating of his heart beneath the dark tunic. She was safe, and she was home. The Iron Wolf had returned from the abyss. The Crippled Maid had become a queen in all but name. Together they had broken the heavy chains of their pasts. The long, bitter winter was truly over. Spring had finally claimed Blackrock Castle. To me, the best part of this chapter is seeing Bridget finally realize her own worth. It proves that true queens aren't born in silk. They are forged in the fire. If you're loving their story, please hit subscribe. I'd also love to know where you're listening from today, so drop your city in the comments. And what do you think should happen in Chapter 3? Leave your plot ideas below, and I'll see you in the next one.